Fine. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I know you have some very fond memories of Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, and I want you to kind of recount for us what kind of man he was and how you know him and the kind of impact that Adam had on the black community. Who was Adam?
Well, I remember I was maybe 9, at the most 10 years old. I was living in Queens, in Hollis, Queens, and there was a black nationalist bookstore on on Hollis Avenue. I don't remember the cross street, but I went to PS 134, and I remember it was around the time that my parents had separated, so it was very traumatic for me. So I used to wander around in this bookstore during lunch period because I didn't want to be around other kids. I didn't want to talk. And I never forget, I was already a boy preacher, had been ordained by Bishop F.T. Washington. And I saw this book with a preacher on the cover. The reason I knew he was a preacher is he had a clergyman's collar. And it said Adam Clayton Powell by Claude Brown or Claude Lewis. And I saved up my little money. I used to get like a quarter allowance. I think paperback books then were like 99 cents. And this had to be 64, 65. And I bought the book. And it started talking about how this man, who looked white to me on the cover, by the way, was a black congressman, but also pastored this huge Baptist church in Harlem. How all of the things that I was seeing on TV with the Civil Rights Movement, he had done in Harlem 20 years before that. The bus boycotts, the boycotts against public utilities. He was the first one to use the black church as a political instrument as well as a spiritual institution. And I immediately fell in love with him. And I would buy the newspaper every day. In fact, I started reading the papers every day because of Adam Clayton Powell. And for years, until I was in my 30s, I would cut out clippings on Powell. There was a time I probably had the best newspaper folder on Adam Clayton Powell. Every time it was in the paper, whether it was good or bad, I would cut it out. And I kept bugging my mother that I wanted to meet him. I wanted to meet him. I wanted to meet him. And at that time, we had moved on into Brooklyn, into the Albany projects. As I said, my parents had separated, and my mother couldn't sustain our house. And during those days, people in Brooklyn used to say it was dangerous to let your kids go to Harlem. People in Harlem said it was dangerous to let your kids go to Brooklyn. So it took a real chore for me to get my mother to let me go to Harlem. Mm-hmm. And to let me go on a Sunday morning when I was supposed to be at Washington Temple where I was the junior pastor. Finally, I remember my mother let me go one Sunday morning with my sister. My sister was 3 years older than me. We took the New Lodge train. It was the number 2 train then. It's number 3 now. And got off 135th Street, walked up 3 blocks to 138th Street, and went in the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And that particular Sunday, Powell didn't show up. And I was very disappointed. And I was afraid my mother would not let me try again. But about 2 months later, she let me try again. And I'll never forget, I was sitting in like the middle of one of the center sections, and the choir began singing the sermonic hymn. And I was extremely tense because I thought again Powell wasn't going to show. And the side door opened where on what would be the left-hand side if you're facing the pulpit, and Adam Powell walked out. And I thought I had seen God. I don't think I've been more excited since seeing a human being than when I was 11 years old and watched Adam Clayton Powell. And he had a way he would hold his shoulders back and strut. He didn't walk, he strutted. I never saw a man that sent off such a proud air, such an aura of arrogance like Adam Powell. And he preached that morning about love. I'll never forget it. And what became probably a turning point in my life was after the service. Now you gotta remember, I'm 11 years old, boy preacher, holiness church. Didn't even go to Baptist church that much then. I was strictly in the Church of God in Christ. So I went back with my sister to the pastor's study, And in those days, they had a door to the secretary of his, where it was like open at the top and closed at the bottom. It was like a half door. And I could barely be seen over the half because I was a little boy. And I looked up, and the secretary finally came and kind of looked down at me, kind of confused, and said, "Yes, son, may I help you?" I said, "Yes, I'd like to see the pastor." And she kind of looked at me and smirked. She said, "You'd like to do what?" I said, "I'd like to see the pastor." And she says, "Well, who might I tell the pastor would like to see him?" I said, "Reverend Alfred Sharpton." She said, "Reverend Alfred Sharpton?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she went behind some door and came back doing her work, obviously ignoring me. So I knocked on a little half door again, and she came back, and I made the request again. She finally went back in somewhere and came back in a few seconds with a look of real surprise on her face. And she looked at me and she says, "Follow me." And she opened the half door. And I followed her, and my sister nervously followed me. And we went behind this wall that was like plexiglass. And when I walked in this room, looked up, Adam Clayton Powell was standing there with no undershirt, no shirt, just his pants on. He had his arm around 2 or 3 elderly women, looked like church mothers. And he looked down, he says, "Alfred Sharpton, of Washington Temple Church of God in Christ." And I looked up, I said, "You know me?" He said, "Of course, you're the boy preacher. I hear you're on FD's broadcast." So now I was in euphoria. My whole life changed then. I wanted to be Adam Clayton Powell. To think that this big man who is shaking America knew me, it was, a life-changing experience. And he told me to have a seat. He treated me like I was a visiting dignitary. And he finished talking to the church mothers, and he asked me how Bishop Washington was doing, and Madam Washington. I later found out that he helped to get the mortgage for Washington Temple when Bishop Washington bought the Lowe's Theater that is still Washington Temple today on Bedford and Bergen. A black church couldn't get a mortgage, but Adam Clayton Powell had the clout in Washington that got him the mortgage. And at the end of his talking to me and the church mothers, he had by then dressed and wiped off, had been sweating from preaching. And he said, "Kid, I'm going down to the Red Rooster, which is a bar restaurant on the corner from the church. Come on down and have a drink with me." I said, "A drink? I'm 11 years old." He said, "I'll have a Coca-Cola." And I went and sat all afternoon while he held court in the back of Red Rooster. And all kinds of people that I would see in the Amsterdam news and I would hear about on television would come by, and he'd sit there with his cigar, smoking, and obviously taking care of business. And I developed a habit of any time I heard he was in town, I would attach myself to his entourage. And to the surprise of many, Odell Clark, who was the top 8 of his, who lived next door to the church, and Jack Packett, who used to drive him, he would not chase me away. He would let me ride around in Jack Packett's station wagon with them. I remember I went one night, he did David Frost's show. I went one night, he did Dick Cavett show. He was very kind and open to me, which really inspired me to be in politics. You got to remember, this is before I knew who Reverend William Jones was, before I ever heard of Jesse Jackson. I'm talking 1968, 69, no, 1967, 68. 67, he got in trouble in Congress, and we all went to Washington and marched. And the older I got, the more I realized that Adam Clayton Powell, probably more than any African American, changed the 20th century for black people. What we know as the Civil Rights Movement, he did 20 years before the Civil Rights Movement. Adam Clayton Powell is responsible for blacks driving buses in Harlem 20 years before the Montgomery boycott. He led the fight at Con Edison. They would not hire blacks to work at Con Edison. Adam Powell led the fight where he had blacks cut off their lights on Tuesday nights and called it Black Tuesday, and forced the utility company to hire the first blacks. He also told blacks to pay their light bill with pennies, which jammed up the paying stations to where out of frustrations they hired the first black Con Ed people. Today, the most Con Ed employees are black as a tribute to Adam Powell. telephone company. In those days, you went through the operator type system. He jammed up the lines by saying, every time you dial a phone, dial operator and make her get your numbers, which tie up the switchboards. The people on Wall Street and other places in the city couldn't get their phone calls through because blacks had jammed up the line. Hired the first 4 blacks as telephone operators because of Adam Clayton Powell. As I said, the bus company. When Martin Luther King started the Montgomery boycott, he said publicly he learned the tactics reading a book called Marching Blacks by Adam Clayton Powell. Marching Blacks was written by Powell in 1944. Not only did it outline the civil rights movement, it also was in the early 40s when most blacks were not calling themselves blacks. They weren't even Negroes in the 40s. They were colored then. Show you how far advanced he was. Later in life, when I began reading and studying Malcolm X, Malcolm talked about the Bandung Conference. Adam Clayton Powell went to the Bandung Conference. Powell asked Eisenhower to send a delegation to the Bandung Conference. This is the first international conference of people of color. The Chinese, the Arab, and the African nations. And the United States refused to recognize the conference. Adam took his own money and went, and was able to convince the courier to give him credentials as a reporter so he could be there as a credentialed newsman, and was literally at the Bandung conference that Malcolm preached about. And at the same time, Powell refused to be intimidated. With all his power, with all his conduct, he never would let whites tell him what he could do. He had Malcolm X preach at his church. And you got to remember, Abyssinia was the premier church of the black world. To have a black Muslim spokesperson for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad speak for that in the pulpit at that time was unheard of. You have black ministers today afraid to even talk to Farrakhan. 30 years ago, Adam had Malcolm preach in his pulpit. In the 30s, when he was marching in Harlem, there was a black man that they called the Black Hitler, called Sufi. He was a black nationalist leader in Harlem. That's who Adam did the Harlem boycotts with. So Adam defied the so-called white establishment. At the same time, he used the political establishment. And maybe that's where a lot of us got it from. Adam used to always tell me, kid, don't ever let people choose your friends or choose your enemies, and always choose your own goals and your own ways of achieving them. And he was the architect of the Great Society. War on Poverty was put through Congress by Adam Clayton Powell. Minimum Wage Bill, Adam Clayton Powell. Aid to Public Education, Adam Clayton Powell. So when you hear the Republicans today talk about ending the Roosevelt-Johnson type of New Deal, Great Society legislation, they're really talking about ending what Adam Clayton Powell put through. They just don't want to give a black man credit for altering social policy of the 20th century. Adam Clayton Powell did it and put it through Congress, and it was written in his committee. So the impact he had on black America and the impact he had on America, I think no one equals it in the history of this century. One of the things that haunts me to this day, and it's probably one of the reasons when I formed National Action Network, the Cray Doherty National Action Network is the position papers of Adam Clayton Powell. He wrote in his autobiography 15 or 16 points that blacks should conduct themselves as, and that is the Cray Do. I run my organization under. But I never forget, a thing that haunts me is that Adam died on April 4th, 1972. On April 6, 1972, there was an editorial in the New York Times, and the New York Times is the mouthpiece of the establishment. Powell used to call the New York Times the Cracker Bible. I'm talking about on television. It was his official term. And they wrote this editorial that to this day hurts me to even think about it. They said on April 4th, 1968, a black leader named Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis. 4 years later to the day, April 4th, 1972, a black leader named Adam Powell died in Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, Florida. One died and left a legacy. The other died and left nothing. And I never resented something more in my life for them to even suggest 2 days after his death that a man who changed life as we knew it for us and for other Americans that were poor left no legacy. And at first, I would denounce Dr. King as an Uncle Tom, but then as I grew older, I said, well, it's not Dr. King's fault. They always try to play one against the other. It's really they don't want us to follow a model of protest and power. Even if they'll accept protest, you're not supposed to ever have power. Adam Powell preached power, economic power and political power, and did it, and never bowed to them. He was defiant. One of the facts of Powell's life was he made a speech at Howard University in '63 where he was the first one to utter the term black power. And when they asked him about it, he said, we must seek audacious power. Not just power, audacious power. We must have audacity. We must be arrogant with it. And whites wanted to erase him from history because they never wanted us to emulate that. And one of the things that bothered me is that in many ways we let whites do that to us. And we here in New York ought to do for Powell what blacks in Atlanta did for King, because Powell, in concrete terms, did more than anybody. His birthday is November 29th. You know, I'm about the only organization in town that even has something for his birthday. And it's amazing to me how they've been able to reduce a man that, I don't care who you name, he did more than they've tried to erase him from history. I asked his oldest son, Adam III, once. I said, you know, when I hung around your father, you knew him. His youngest son really didn't know him that well because he separated from his mother when they were very young. I said, what, does anything he was afraid of? I never saw him seem like anything bothered him or he had any fear. And his son said, in his later years, he said to him, the only thing that bothers me, the only thing I fear is that they don't forget. That they don't forget. And I told him, I said, as long as I live, they'll never forget. And he was a man that prided himself in not worrying and not fearing anything. That's the only thing he was afraid of. And I understand that fear now because I think he knew better than we did that they never want us to walk in the footsteps of real giants. So the way they try to do that is erase their footprints in the sand.
Let me ask you, in terms of legislation, you gave us a few pieces of legislation, but what was the overall impact on the legislation on Congress that Powell had?
It changed Congress's focus. It made poverty a priority. It made training a priority, manpower training development that came from Powell, which really began the training and educating of a whole new generation of blacks that were able to, we're in the second generation of that, to achieve corporate positions and political positions they couldn't have achieved before. Minimum wage put a basement on what people could make as working class people, black and white in this country. That came from Powell. Aids to the arts, aids to public education. All of that, Powell changed society where government became responsible for its citizens, which is antithetical to what the Republicans are doing today, where they're saying no private enterprise must be free and government has no responsibility. It was Adam Powell that legislated government responsibility for the people.
Mm-hmm. How much legislation would you say he passed on to?
While he was chairman of House Education and Labor Committee, he passed 60 bills in 5 years. There were letters given to him by the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House saying that there was never a more productive chairman of a committee in the history of Congress than Adam Clayton Powell. And
how long was he in Congress?
He was in Congress for 22 years. He went in, he was sworn in 45, and he was defeated under questionable circumstances in 1970 by Charles Rangel. I remember I was at the press conference after he was defeated, and there was a demand for a recount. He only lost for like 100 votes, and it was proven after he died that 230 people who was dead voted in the election. But I remember we were sitting in his office, and the cameras were there, and they said, Reverend Powell, what do you think of Charlie Rangel, who has won this primary? And he puffed on his cigar. He says, who? They said, Charlie Rangel. He says, who? They said, Charlie Rangel. He said, oh, you mean Charlie's Charlie. And I never forget how he would spin a phrase and cut people down. I mean, he had no problem with all his power doing what he felt was right and calling names. We'd be in the car, Jack Packett's van, and he'd be riding downtown to one of the Broadway shows. He loved Broadway shows. And he did Sardi's where all the theater people were. The first time I was in Sardi's, he took me and Lucille Ball was in there, and they would like knock over tables trying to get to Adam because he was very handsome and erect and proud. And we were riding from the church downtown, and he was going to take me to Sardi's, and he saw a little crowd. In those days on 125th Street, there was always a lot of people on the ladders speaking. That's where I first met Charles Kenyatta, who was also close to Adam. And Adam saw people stand on the ladder speaking in a crowd, and he jumped out the car. He had on a tailored suit. He took his jacket off and jumped on the ladder and just preached for about an hour about Marcus Garvey. Garvey was his hero, like he was mine. When he was a kid, 10, 11 years old, Garvey's hall was next door to Abyssinia Church. And he would sneak out his father's church and go hear Garvey. And he would tell us about the Garvey parade. And then he'd put his jacket back on and ride on downtown. And people just knew he was with them. I remember I was standing outside at his funeral, and the head of the NAACP at the time, I can't remember his name, an older gentleman, he came out, he knew I knew Adam well. He gave me his ticket. He said, Adam would have wanted you inside. And I went in the funeral because you had to have a ticket to get in. And I remember the reporters were interviewing people. He was such a controversial man. Why are you here? It was about 100,000 people jammed the streets. And one woman said to a reporter, she said, my son was on death row. They was going to kill my boy. And I came to Reverend Powell, and he wouldn't let him do it. Another one said, I lost my job as a porter, and the union couldn't help me. I came to Reverend Powell. He made one call and saved my income for my family. I mean, that's who Adam was. He was a guy that would take care of the little people. He used to tell me I was born into a well-bred family. I was educated at Columbia and Colgate, went to the best schools, born with money. He says, but black bourgeois are nothing. He said, stay with the little people. They're the only ones that have integrity. He never hung out with his class. The closest people around him, like I said, Odell Packard and them, were regular working people. I never saw him hang out with the 100 black men crowd. Adam had nothing to do with people in his own so-called income category. Didn't hang out with a lot of preachers. He was basically known as a loner. And he loved the little people. And he used to always tell me that kids, stay with the little people. They're the only ones that have character. The only thing the bourgeois want is to use you and abuse you. And he'd keep on walking. And that's how he was. And he really, really was what he preached. I remember he had an apartment over Duncan's funeral home, 135th Street and 7th Avenue, about 3 blocks from the church. And he had a strange habit. This one habit I never was able to do. He never kept a phone at home. So if an important call came in and he hadn't come to the church yet, because I was the kid hanging out, getting everybody nerve, they would send me sometime to give him a message. And they had a special buzzer they would, signal so he would know to answer the door. And he had a secretary named Waldo Paris. Waldo said, run down to the apartment, kid, and tell Congressman Powell that the President of the United States on the phone, Lyndon Johnson. So I was all excited, the President of the United States on the phone. I run down 135th Street for 138, and I did the little ring the way we were supposed to. No answer. Did it again. He finally came to the top of the stairs. He says, what is it? I said, Congressman Powell, Reverend Powell, they sent me down, this is the kid, to tell you that the President of the United States on the phone at the church. He needs to speak to you. He says, all right. So I stood there, no movement. I said, well, what do I tell him? You tell him that you gave me the message. Big Daddy's resting. And he closed his apartment door, went back inside. About 3 hours later, he waltzed into the office, and the White House had called 2 or 3 more times. He didn't return the call. He waited about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Secretary came back again and said, this is the 6th call the President's on. He said, put it through. And he picked up the phone at his office, and the Secretary put the President on. And we're all sitting there now. And he picks up the phone. He says, Lyndon, baby, how can I help you? I mean, you remember, I'm 12 years old watching this kind of awesome power. And Johnson said something about he needed Powell to do something. And Powell said, but you know, I have a problem, Lyndon. I'm trying to get this little bill through for the brothers and sisters up here, and I can't seem to get cooperation. So he knew how to use his leverage to get them to the point of hysterics, and he would cut a deal for us and then give them what they wanted. And he did it without blinking an eye. He was a brilliant, brilliant political figure.
Mm-hmm. How would you compare him with today's politicians?
Today's politicians?
Yeah.
To compare Adam Powell with today's politician is like comparing a light bulb with the sun.
Explain that.
The sun operates on its own power and lights up the world. A light bulb is cut on and off by others. Politicians today are cut on and off by others. They do not operate on their own energy. They're not even in the same world with Adam Clayton Powell.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think it is a disservice to his memory to even mention him in the same breath with them. I think that white America has succeeded in the generation behind him to erase him. It is my generation that must redeem him.
You mentioned about Powell's his negotiating skill, his tactics, and that was a hell of a view of him. But can you give us more? I mean, I'd like to know more about how he was able to do the things he did.
Because he knew that he served people and that they would vote the way he told them, and that they couldn't vote him out. And in the 50s, he would tell this story, and I read about it. In the 50s, he was indicted for income tax, and he had refused to support Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee for president. So in those days, Tammany Hall ran New York. Carmine DeSapio was the head of Tammany Hall. He decided he was going to get rid of Powell. Powell was getting ready to go to jail for taxes. He had kicked or bolted the Democratic Party. He called all the district leaders in Harlem, 9 of them, down to his office and said, it's time to get rid of Adam. Choose a candidate, we're going after him. And all of the district leaders, other than Lloyd Dickens, whose daughter now is a district leader in Harlem, went with Tammany Hall. Adam went to the streets and took them on. No white person could beat Tammany Hall. Adam beat them 4-1. They ran a councilman named Earl Brown, who had gone to Harvard University, was a member of the New York City Council, and a columnist in the Amsterdam News. And the Amsterdam News supported Earl Brown against Powell. Powell hit the streets, called him Look Down Brown, Look Down Uncle Tom Brown, and beat him 4-1. They couldn't tell him what to do. And he hired J. Raymond Jones, who had been in retirement, to run his campaign. And after he won, the governor's race was that year. Averell Harriman and Nelson Rockefeller had to come to Harlem and beg for his support, and he'd make them do so. Powell used to tell me, don't ever support anybody unless you can explain to the people what you're getting for it. And don't take it for yourself, take it for the people. If you take care of the people will give you whatever you want. And that's why he could go to Puerto Rico and Bimini on vacation. People didn't care that Adam would be on vacation because when they needed him, he was there. He had delivered for them, and they know he couldn't be bought, bossed, or intimidated. And the way he did the flair in public was the way he was. I was there. As a kid, I got to be around a lot of great people because people, sometimes let kids hang around because they figure, what does a kid know? But a kid grows up and remembers all of that. And he was one of the few black men I know in private was the same as he was in public. Nobody told Adam Clayton Powell what to do. The night we went to do the David Frost show, I told you, but I'll never forget, he had on black turtleneck sweater and a black jacket, and he had this medallion that, in fact, I got wearing medallions from Adam Powell, later Jesse Jackson. And the medallion was really an award. People didn't know it. That had been given to him from Haile Selassie. When Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, visited the United States for the first time, he came to Abyssinia and gave Adam a medallion, which was the Gold Knight Order of Ethiopia, and he gave him a Coptic cross that was in the pulpit of Abyssinia, 7-foot gold, solid gold cross, because Abyssinia was the name for Ethiopia, and Adam preached that. Adam was the first man I ever heard say Jesus was black. One Sunday, he was preaching and he looked up at the mural and he said, see that white picture of Jesus up there? And members of the church nodded. Get it out of here. Jesus was a black man. What are you doing with this hunky up on the walls of Abyssinia? That's how he preached. I think the mural's still there, but he told me to get it down. And he had on that medallion that night. And I never forget the first question David Frost said. He says, Adam Clayton Powell, you've been described as many things by many people. How would you describe yourself? And Adam kind of smiled and he looked at him. He said, I'm the only man in America, black or white, that doesn't give a damn. And Frost said, a damn about what? He said, about y'all, about what y'all think about me. I really don't give a damn. And he says, but you're a walking contradiction. You're the pastor of one of the largest Baptist churches in the country, a senior member of Congress, chairman of a powerful committee, a civil rights leader, yet you've been married 3 or 4 times, an income tax evader, been sued for defamation. How do you explain your high lifestyle? Adam kind of smiled and said, don't be jealous, baby, don't be jealous. I mean, he just didn't seek their approval. I think that we've had 2 great black ministers this century. And we're at the end of the century just about. So I would say we've had 2 great ones. Black ministers out of the black Christian church that have achieved real greatness. And that would probably be Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell. The difference between King and Powell to me is that Powell never sought the approval or sanction of white America. He really defied them. In fact, he preferred to defy them, even when he didn't have to. And that would be the difference between Adam and Martin. Both profound, both deep, both did a lot for our people. But Adam never sought their stamp of approval.
I'm just going to ask you 2 other questions, Reverend. And the first one is that you say you founded National Action Network on the principles of Adam. What were those principles?
Adam Clayton Powell, I'll give you a copy of it. Adam Clayton Powell had a credo that he wrote that blacks should be the leaders of their own organization, should finance their own organization, must become producers, not consumers, must be registered to vote, that we ought to demand our percentage of whatever our population was. If we're 20% of a city, we should demand that much of the contracts, 20% of the public contracts and the positions, all the way down the line. And those are the principles of the National Action Network.
And finally, what would you say to people in regard to Adam? I know you've said a lot, but as a final message, what would you want that message to go out?
If you're going to talk about black empowerment, if you're going to talk about the human or civil rights struggle, if you're going to talk about blacks protesting and rebelling against white supremacy and white racism, if you're going to talk about someone that perfected the use of the black church as an instrument for liberation, just like the Bible starts with Adam, all of that started with Adam. And Adam Powell is the penultimate black preacher activist. And all others are mere imitators. And most of them couldn't carry a lantern to his feet.
Thank you.
I got something for you.
continue to allow they had a spiritual way of life. No problem. I have to explain it to you. Religion is man-made. Oh, just a moment. Religion is man-made. A spiritual way of life is cosmic laws, universal laws. Man can't make universal laws. That's what I'm trying to say to you. If you understand those laws and use those laws like ancient Egyptians did and built that great civilization like they did, then you will understand your spiritual connection with yourself and your okay, now one more question. Do you understand what I'm saying? One more question now. It's not true. Hold it now. I don't want you to go into a speech on it. I want you to stick strictly to the question. I explain to you. If you want to hold on to Islam, whatever you believe in, you have the right to do that. I have no right to tell you not to be a Muslim. I have no right to tell you not to be a Christian if that's what you want to be. I can only explain to you in reality. The reality of religion. Okay? Now, total man-made religion that put their stamp on these particular laws and incorporate these creator universal laws into this various religion and then give it to you. And you accept that. So if you accept that, if you say you understand what I'm saying, right? If you understand what I'm saying, then that ends the question. See, because I have given you a fact. And that's the word religion to be consistent, perhaps with health. Take the word religion out. And put natural laws in its place.